Sarah Chin pressed her trembling fingers against the radio transmitter, static crackling through the abandoned broadcasting station as she adjusted the frequency for what might be the last time. The concrete walls around her bore the scars of desperate battles, bullet holes, dried bloodstains, and hastily barricaded windows that barely held back the moaning darkness outside. She had been a traffic reporter just a month ago, concerned with rush-hour delays and weekend construction projects, but now she found herself the sole voice cutting through the endless night that had swallowed America whole. The emergency broadcast equipment hummed with an eerie persistence, powered by a diesel generator that Marcus, her unlikely companion, kept running with salvaged fuel from abandoned gas stations. Marcus had been a maintenance worker for the city's emergency services, a quiet man in his 50s who knew every tunnel, every backup system, every forgotten corner of the urban infrastructure that now served as their lifeline. Together, they had transformed the small station into something more than just a broadcasting hub. It had become a beacon of hope in a world where hope seemed as extinct as the civilization that once thrived beyond these walls. The outbreak had started subtly, like most disasters do, with scattered reports of violent incidents in major cities that the news dismissed as isolated cases of drug-induced psychosis or domestic terrorism. Sarah remembered covering those early stories, her biggest concern being whether traffic would be delayed around the hospital districts. But the incidents multiplied exponentially, and within 72 hours the term zombie had evolved from Hollywood fiction to grim reality as the infected dead began to outnumber the living. The government's response had been swift but ultimately futile. Military cordons, evacuation zones, and emergency broadcasts that gradually became more desperate and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Now, 3 weeks later, Sarah's improvised radio show had become one of the few remaining threads connecting scattered survivors across the wasteland that had once been the United States. Every evening at sunset, when the infected seemed to grow more aggressive and the world outside became a symphony of inhuman sounds, Sarah would power up the transmitter and speak into the darkness. Her voice carried across hundreds of miles, reaching survivors holed up in farmhouses, shopping malls, school gymnasiums, and anywhere else that offered temporary refuge from the relentless hunger that prowled the streets. She shared practical information, which areas to avoid, where clean water might be found, how to distinguish between the fast-moving fresh infected and the slower but more numerous decomposing ones that had been shambling for weeks. But more importantly, she reminded them that they weren't alone, that somewhere in the darkness, other human hearts still beat with the stubborn rhythm of resistance. Marcus monitored multiple frequencies, picking up fragments of conversations from survivor groups, emergency services still operating in isolated pockets, and even military units that continued fighting despite the collapse of Central Command. He had rigged together a sophisticated listening system using salvaged electronics, creating a network of information that flowed through their small station like blood through a heart. They had learned to identify the distinct patterns of different survivor groups: the family that had fortified a rural school and broadcast technical tips every Tuesday, the former Coast Guard unit that had taken refuge on an offshore oil platform and shared maritime escape routes, and the mysterious voice that called itself Phoenix, and seemed to be organizing larger resistance movements from somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. But tonight felt different as Sarah prepared for her broadcast. The sounds outside had changed over the past week. The random moaning and shuffling had been replaced by something that seemed almost organized, as if the infected were learning, adapting, becoming something more than mindless hunger. Marcus had reported similar observations from other survivors, stories of infected that moved with purpose, that seemed to respond to signals only they could understand. Even more disturbing were the reports of infected that had begun to use tools, opening doors, manipulating simple mechanisms, and showing a level of coordination that suggested the virus or whatever had caused this apocalypse was still evolving. Sarah checked her watch, 7:47 p.m., 13 minutes until her regular broadcast time. The generator hummed steadily in the basement, but she could hear something else now, a low rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from multiple directions. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his face pale in the green glow of the emergency lighting, and nodded toward the reinforced door that led to the stairwell. "They're in the building," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the static from the radio equipment. "Not just a few stragglers, sounds like dozens of them moving together like they're searching for something specific." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the microphone, knowing that if this was their last broadcast, it needed to count for something more than just another evening of reassurance and survival tips. The voices in the darkness weren't just the survivors anymore. Something else was learning to speak, and humanity's time to respond was running out faster than anyone had imagined. The emergency lighting flickered as Sarah's finger hovered over the transmitter switch, the familiar weight of the microphone suddenly feeling like a loaded weapon in her hands. Through the reinforced door, the rhythmic scraping had grown louder, accompanied by what sounded impossibly like whispered communication, not the mindless moaning they had grown accustomed to, but something that resembled actual coordination. Marcus crouched beside the jury-rigged security monitor, his face illuminated by the green glow of night vision cameras he had installed throughout the building's stairwells and corridors. What they saw defied everything they thought they knew about the infected. The creatures moved with purpose, some positioned at strategic points while others methodically searched each floor, their movements synchronized like a military sweep operation. "They're not just hunting randomly," Marcus whispered, his voice tight with disbelief as he watched the screen. "Look at their formation, they've got sentries at the exits, search teams moving floor by floor, and that group near the main entrance is just waiting." Sarah leaned closer to the monitor, her heart racing as she observed the infected's behavior. These weren't the shambling, disorganized hordes from the early weeks of the outbreak. The creatures moved with an efficiency that suggested they had learned, adapted, and somehow developed tactical awareness. Even more disturbing, several of them carried improvised tools, pieces of rebar, broken glass fashioned into crude weapons, and what appeared to be simple communication devices cobbled together from salvaged electronics. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow when she noticed one of the infected holding what looked like a modified radio receiver, its head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. The implications crashed over her in waves of horror and understanding. They weren't just being hunted, they were being tracked through their own broadcasts. Every night when she had spoken into the darkness, offering hope and guidance to survivors scattered across the wasteland, she had been painting a target on their location. The infected had learned to follow the radio signals, to triangulate their position, and now they had come to silence the voice that had been rallying human resistance. Marcus began frantically disconnecting equipment, his hands shaking as he realized the full scope of their situation. "We have to shut everything down," he hissed, but Sarah grabbed his wrist, stopping him mid-motion. "If we go silent now, every survivor listening will think we're dead," she said, her voice barely audible above the growing sounds of the hunt outside. "They'll lose hope, stop trying to coordinate, maybe even give up entirely." The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. How many people across the country were counting on her voice? How many had structured their own survival around the information and encouragement she provided every evening? The sound of splintering wood echoed through the station as the infected began testing the reinforced doors on the lower floors. Sarah made her decision with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. She flipped the transmitter to emergency broadcast mode, knowing it would boost their signal across a wider range but also make them even easier to track. "This is Sarah Chin at Station Kadian," she spoke rapidly into the microphone, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who knew these might be her last words. "Code red emergency broadcast. The infected have learned to track radio transmissions. They're coordinating, using tools, and specifically targeting communication hubs. If you're broadcasting, assume you're being hunted. Switch to burst transmissions only, change frequencies regularly, and for God's sake, don't stay in one location." Marcus had already begun implementing their escape plan, opening the concealed panel that led to Denver's forgotten utility tunnels. The city's underground infrastructure had been expanded during the Cold War, creating a network of maintenance passages, storm drains, and emergency conduits that few people knew existed. As the sounds of the hunt grew closer, Sarah continued her broadcast, sharing every detail she could about the infected's new capabilities while Marcus gathered their essential equipment. "They're not just evolved," she continued, watching the security monitors as the infected breached the third floor. "They're learning from us, adapting our tactics, turning our own strengths against us. The war has changed and we need to change with it." The first infected reached their floor just as Marcus finished loading their portable radio equipment into waterproof cases. Sarah delivered her final message with the kind of desperate intensity that cuts through static and reaches directly into the hearts of those who need to hear it most. "This is Sarah Chin signing off from Denver but not signing off from the fight. Find us on the emergency frequencies. Keep moving, keep fighting, and remember, they may have learned to hunt us but we're going to learn to hunt them back." She cut the transmission just as the door began to buckle under the weight of multiple infected throwing themselves against it. The escape into the tunnels was a desperate plunge into a different kind of darkness, one that offered the possibility of survival rather than certain death. As they splashed through ankle-deep water in the maintenance passages, Sarah couldn't shake the image of the infected with their improvised tools and coordinated movements. The outbreak had entered a new phase, one that would require entirely different strategies and a level of human cooperation that might be their species' only hope for survival. Behind them, the sounds of the hunt continued, but ahead lay the unknown, and possibly, if they were lucky, other voices in the darkness who had learned to resist the endless night. The tunnel system beneath Denver stretched into darkness like the arteries of some massive underground organism, and Sarah quickly discovered that she and Marcus weren't the only ones who had sought refuge in the city's forgotten depths. The sound of their splashing footsteps through the maintenance corridor was answered by the distinctive double click of a flashlight, a signal that Marcus immediately recognized as military code. "Friend or foe?" came a voice from the shadows ahead, spoken in the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to command. Marcus raised his hands slowly, the portable radio equipment still clutched in his grip, and responded with the appropriate countersign he remembered from his days working with emergency services. "Civilian survivors seeking shelter," he called back, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. What emerged from the darkness was a woman in her 40s, dressed in a modified military uniform that had been adapted for underground operations. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, and she had been the communications officer for the Colorado National Guard when the outbreak began. Behind her, a network of tunnels had been transformed into something that resembled a military command center crossed with a refugee camp. Generator-powered lights strung along the walls illuminated makeshift living spaces carved out of maintenance alcoves, while the main passage had been converted into a communications hub that would have impressed even the most well-equipped surface installations. The tunnel rats, as Rodriguez's people called themselves, had been living underground for nearly 2 weeks, and they had learned things about the infected that made Sarah's recent discoveries seem like just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying pattern. Rodriguez led them through the network, explaining how her unit had been forced underground when the infected began demonstrating tactical awareness that surpassed anything in their training manuals. "It started with simple coordination," she explained, her voice barely audible above the hum of electronics and the distant sound of generators. "But within days we were seeing infected units that moved like they had military training, flanking maneuvers, coordinated assaults, even what looked like reconnaissance missions. The tunnel walls were lined with maps, charts, and surveillance equipment that painted a picture of the surface world that was both fascinating and horrifying. The infected hadn't just taken over the cities, they had organized them." Sarah stared at the reconnaissance photos Rodriguez's people had taken during carefully planned surface missions. The images showed infected gathered in what appeared to be organized formations, with distinct hierarchies and specialized roles. Some infected seemed to function as sentries, posted at strategic locations and rotating shifts with military precision. Others appeared to be scouts, ranging far from the main groups and returning with what looked like intelligence about human survivor locations. Most disturbing of all were the infected that Rodriguez's team had designated as alphas, creatures that seemed to direct the others through a combination of complex gestures and vocalizations that resembled a primitive but effective communication system. "They're hurting us," Rodriguez said, pointing to a large tactical map that showed the movement patterns of both infected and survivor groups across the Denver metropolitan area. "Every survivor group that's been forced underground, every safe house that's been compromised, every escape route that's been cut off, it's all part of a pattern. They're not just hunting us randomly. They're systematically eliminating our ability to operate on the surface while driving us into controllable spaces." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The infected weren't just evolving, they were implementing a strategy that would give them complete control over the human population. Marcus studied the communication equipment that Rodriguez's team had assembled, recognizing components salvaged from military installations, emergency services, and civilian broadcasting stations. "You've been monitoring everything," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Every survivor group, every military unit, every broadcast." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "We've been trying to map the resistance, to understand who's still fighting and who might be able to coordinate a response. But what we've discovered is that the infected are monitoring us too. They're learning from our communications, adapting to our tactics, and staying consistently one step ahead." The revelation that the infected had been systematically targeting communication hubs wasn't just about eliminating sources of information. It was about isolating survivor groups and preventing them from coordinating any kind of organized resistance. Sarah realized that her broadcasts hadn't just been offering hope to scattered survivors. They had been one of the few things preventing the infected from achieving complete tactical superiority. "There's someone else you need to know about," Rodriguez said, leading them to a secure communication station buried deep within the tunnel network. "We've been in contact with a group that calls itself Phoenix. They're not just surviving, they're fighting back, and they've got information about what's really happening. The radio crackled to life as Rodriguez made contact with the mysterious Phoenix network, and Sarah listened with growing amazement as voices from across the country began to check in. These weren't just isolated survivor groups clinging to life in abandoned buildings and remote locations. They were organized resistance cells, military units that had maintained operational capability, and civilian groups that had developed effective countermeasures against the infected's evolving tactics. Phoenix isn't just a group, Rodriguez explained as the voices continued to report in from locations spanning multiple states. It's a network of networks, a coordinated resistance that's been growing stronger even as the infected have been evolving. But as Sarah listened to the reports coming in from Phoenix operatives, she realized that the situation was even more complex than anyone had imagined. The infected weren't just becoming more intelligent, they were becoming more human, retaining memories and skills from their previous lives while serving some larger purpose that none of the survivors had yet been able to understand. The war for humanity's survival had become something that transcended simple combat between the living and the dead. It had become a battle for the very definition of what it meant to be human, and the outcome would determine not just who survived, but what kind of world would emerge from the endless night that had consumed America. The secure communication chamber deep within Rodriguez's tunnel network hummed with activity as encrypted signals bounced between relay stations scattered across the North American continent. Sarah watched in amazement as Rodriguez's communications team established a direct link with Phoenix's central command, the static-filled voices gradually resolving into clear, coordinated reports from resistance cells operating everywhere from the Florida Everglades to the Canadian border. What she had imagined as a small group of survivors had revealed itself to be something far more significant. A continental network of military personnel, scientists, engineers, and civilians who had not only survived the initial outbreak but had spent the past months studying, adapting, and preparing for a coordinated counteroffensive against the infected. The voice that came through the speakers belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former CDC epidemiologist who had been studying the outbreak from a secure research facility in the Colorado Rockies. Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen the pandemic from its earliest stages and understood its implications better than anyone else still alive. Sarah Chin, Dr. Vasquez said, her voice cutting through the static with remarkable clarity, "We've been monitoring your broadcast since the first week. Your work has been instrumental in keeping survivor morale high and maintaining communication networks across the infected zones. But we need to discuss what you've discovered about the infected's evolution, because our research suggests that what you've witnessed is only the beginning." The Phoenix Network had been established by a coalition of military officers, government scientists, and civilian leaders who had recognized the outbreak's true nature within the first 72 hours. Unlike the official government response, which had focused on containment and evacuation, Phoenix had immediately begun treating the situation as a permanent transformation of human civilization rather than a temporary crisis. Dr. Vasquez explained that their research facilities had been analyzing infected specimens, studying their behavior patterns, and developing countermeasures based on the assumption that the creatures would continue to evolve and adapt. "The virus isn't just reanimating dead tissue," she continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. "It's creating a collective intelligence that appears to be learning from every encounter with human survivors." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature as Dr. Vasquez shared Phoenix's most disturbing discoveries. The infected weren't just becoming more intelligent individually, they were developing a form of networked consciousness that allowed them to share information, coordinate strategies, and adapt to human tactics in real time. Brain scans of recently infected specimens had shown unusual neural activity in areas associated with communication and collective decision-making, suggesting that the virus was literally rewiring human consciousness to serve some larger purpose. "We believe the infected are being directed by what we're calling a hive mind," Dr. Vasquez explained. "Individual infected retain some of their human memories and skills, but they're all connected to a central intelligence that's using them to systematically eliminate human resistance." The implications were staggering. The infected weren't just following instinctive hunger or simple predatory behavior, they were implementing a coordinated strategy designed to capture, not just kill, human survivors. Phoenix's intelligence network had documented infected facilities that appeared to be processing centers, where captured humans were being held for reasons that remained unclear but seemed to involve some form of conversion or assimilation process. "They're not trying to eliminate humanity," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "They're trying to absorb us, to add our knowledge and capabilities to their collective intelligence. Every human they capture makes them stronger, smarter, and more capable of capturing others. Rodriguez's team had been sharing intelligence with Phoenix for weeks, but the contact with Sarah represented a crucial breakthrough in their communication strategy. Her background in broadcasting and her established network of survivor contacts made her uniquely valuable for Phoenix's next phase of operations. "We need someone who can coordinate a simultaneous broadcast across multiple survivor networks," Dr. Vasquez explained. "Someone who understands how to reach people who have lost hope, who can inspire coordinated action across thousands of miles of infected territory." The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. A coordinated strike against infected strongholds that would require precise timing and cooperation between survivor groups that had been isolated from each other for weeks. But Phoenix had discovered something else about the infected that offered a glimmer of hope. The collective intelligence that controlled them had a weakness. It was vulnerable to specific types of electromagnetic interference that could disrupt their coordination and communication. Phoenix's research facilities had developed devices that could create localized dead zones, where individual infected would revert to their original mindless state, unable to coordinate with the larger network. "We're not just planning a military strike," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice gaining strength and determination. "We're planning to sever the connections that hold their collective intelligence together, to force them back into the chaotic, manageable threat they were in the early days of the outbreak." The mission would require Sarah to leave the relative safety of the underground tunnels and travel nearly 1,000 miles to Phoenix's mountain stronghold, carrying portable broadcasting equipment and serving as a mobile communication hub for resistance cells along the route. It was a journey that would take her through some of the most heavily infected territory in North America, where the evolved infected had established what could only be described as cities, organized settlements where captured humans were being held for unknown purposes and where the collective intelligence was strongest. "This is our chance to take back the night," Dr. Vasquez said as the communication session drew to a close. "But we need voices like yours to call humanity back from the edge of extinction. The question is, are you ready to carry that responsibility across a continent that's been consumed by darkness?" The dawn air carried the scent of decay and something else, something that reminded Sarah of ozone before a thunderstorm, as if the very atmosphere had been changed by the presence of the collective intelligence that now controlled most of the North American continent. She crouched beside Marcus and two other Phoenix operatives at the edge of what had once been Kansas City, watching through binoculars as the infected moved through the streets with a coordination that defied everything she had believed about the undead. The city had been transformed into something that could only be described as a living organism, with infected moving along established routes like blood cells through arteries, each one serving a specific function in the larger system that had consumed the urban landscape. The journey from Denver had taken them through territory that revealed the true scope of the infected's evolution. Rural areas that should have been relatively safe had been transformed into vast agricultural complexes where infected tended to crops with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they were receiving constant instruction from the collective intelligence. Small towns had become processing centers where captured humans were held in conditions that were neither cruel nor kind, but rather clinical, as if the infected were studying their prisoners, learning from them, preparing them for some form of integration that none of the Phoenix operatives fully understood. Marcus had documented everything with the portable recording equipment they carried, knowing that this intelligence would be crucial for Phoenix's final assault. But what disturbed Sarah most wasn't the infected's efficiency or their obvious intelligence. It was the fact that many of them still looked recognizably human. Unlike the decomposing hordes from the early weeks of the outbreak, these infected maintained their physical integrity, their clothing, even their personal possessions. They moved with purpose and awareness, and occasionally Sarah caught glimpses of expressions that seemed almost thoughtful. "They're not just infected," she whispered to Marcus as they watched a group of creatures that had once been a family working together to repair a damaged building. "They're still themselves, but they're serving something else." The Phoenix operative team leader, a former Army Ranger named Torres, had been tracking the infected's communication patterns using equipment that Dr. Vasquez had designed specifically to monitor the collective intelligence. The devices revealed a constant stream of electromagnetic activity that flowed between infected groups like a vast neural network spanning hundreds of miles. "It's like watching a brain work," Torres explained, showing Sarah the readouts from his monitoring equipment. "Each infected group is like a cluster of neurons, processing information and sending it back to larger nodes. And somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, there's something that's coordinating all of it." Their mission had taken them through 3 infected cities, each one revealing new aspects of the collective intelligence's capabilities. In the ruins of Topeka, They had discovered infected that were clearly using advanced technology, not just simple tools but computers, communication equipment, and even vehicles that they operated with skill that suggested they retained the technical knowledge of their human lives. In a former military base outside Junction City, they had found infected wearing military uniforms and carrying weapons, moving in formations that demonstrated tactical awareness that rivaled any human military unit. Most disturbing of all, in the suburbs of Kansas City, they had encountered infected that seemed to recognize them as humans rather than just threats, infected that had attempted to communicate, to capture rather than kill. The electromagnetic interference devices that Phoenix had developed worked exactly as Dr. Vasquez had promised, creating localized zones where infected lost their coordination and reverted to the mindless behavior of the early outbreak. But the effect was temporary, and the collective intelligence seemed to be learning from each encounter, adapting its communication methods to work around the interference. "It's like fighting an enemy that gets smarter every time you hurt it," Torres observed as they prepared to make their final push toward the Colorado border. "Every tactical advantage we gain, it finds a way to counter." Sarah's role had evolved during the journey from simple communication relay to something approaching field command. Her broadcasts had become coordination signals for resistance cells across the infected territory, and she had learned to adapt her messages to the tactical requirements of the mission while maintaining the inspirational tone that had made her voice a beacon of hope for scattered survivors. Through her portable equipment, she had been in constant contact with Phoenix Command, receiving updates on the progress of similar teams operating across the continent and coordinating the timing of the final assault. But as they approached the Colorado border, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. The infected weren't just occupying human territory, they were transforming it, turning entire regions into something that served the collective intelligence's purposes. The Rocky Mountains ahead of them weren't just the location of Phoenix's stronghold, they were the heart of the infected's power, the source of the signals that coordinated millions of infected across the continent. "We're not just going to deliver a message," Sarah realized as she watched the mountain peaks rising in the distance. "We're going to walk into the center of whatever this thing is and try to destroy it from the inside." The final transmission came through just as they reached the foothills of the Rockies, Dr. Vasquez's voice carrying news that changed everything they thought they knew about their mission. "Sarah, we've made a discovery about the collective intelligence. It's not just controlling the infected, it's trying to complete some kind of transformation. We think it's attempting to merge human consciousness with something else, something that's been waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Your arrival here isn't just about coordinating the resistance. You may be walking into humanity's last chance to remain human." The Phoenix stronghold carved into the Colorado mountains revealed itself to be far more than a simple military installation. It was humanity's last cathedral, a temple of technology and determination built into the living rock where the final battle for human consciousness would be fought. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she witnessed the scope of the operation Dr. Vasquez had assembled over the past month. Massive electromagnetic arrays pointed toward the sky like the fingers of a giant hand, while deep within the mountain's heart, a quantum communication center hummed with the voices of resistance cells spanning 3 continents. This wasn't just the headquarters of a survivor network, it was the nerve center of humanity's last coordinated stand against an intelligence that had already absorbed most of the species. Dr. Vasquez met them at the facility's entrance, her face bearing the weight of discoveries that had pushed human understanding to its absolute limits. "The collective intelligence isn't from Earth," she said without preamble, leading Sarah and her team through corridors lined with research data that painted a picture of invasion unlike anything in human history. "It's been dormant in human DNA for millennia, waiting for the right conditions to activate. The outbreak wasn't caused by a virus, it was a signal broadcast from somewhere in deep space that awakened something that's been part of us all along." The walls displayed brain scans, genetic analyses, and astronomical data that told the story of humanity's unwitting role as an incubator for an intelligence that had been planted in human genetic code by a civilization that had vanished before Earth's first cities were built. The truth was more terrifying than any zombie apocalypse Sarah had imagined. The collective intelligence was attempting to complete a transformation that would merge human consciousness with an alien awareness, creating a hybrid species that would serve as a bridge between terrestrial and cosmic intelligence. Every infected person retained their human memories and capabilities while becoming part of a vast network that was preparing Earth for the return of its original architects. "They're not trying to destroy us," Dr. Vasquez explained as they reached the command center where Phoenix's final gambit was being prepared. "They're trying to evolve us into something that can survive what's coming from space." The command center bustled with activity as Phoenix operatives from around the world coordinated the most complex military operation in human history. Sarah watched in amazement as screens displayed the positions of resistance cells on every continent, each one equipped with electromagnetic pulse devices that could disrupt the collective intelligence's communication network. The plan was audacious in its scope, a simultaneous global strike that would sever the connections between infected groups, forcing them back into individual consciousness and buying humanity enough time to broadcast a counter-signal that would override the alien programming embedded in human DNA. Sarah's role in the operation went far beyond anything she had imagined when she first spoke into her radio microphone in the ruins of Denver. Her voice had become the coordination signal for the entire resistance, and Phoenix's quantum communication array would amplify her broadcast to reach every human survivor on Earth. "You're not just calling for resistance," Dr. Vasquez explained as technicians prepared the most powerful communication system ever assembled. "You're calling for humanity to remember what it means to be human, to reject the collective consciousness and choose individual identity over cosmic evolution." The countdown to the global strike began at midnight, with Sarah's voice carrying across electromagnetic frequencies that penetrated the collective intelligence's communication network. She spoke not just to the human survivors hiding in bunkers and underground tunnels, but to the infected themselves, to the part of them that remained human despite their transformation. "This is Sarah Chin, speaking to every human consciousness that can still hear these words," she began, her voice carrying the weight of a species' final plea for survival. "You are not alone. You are not abandoned. You are not forgotten. Remember who you were before the signal came. Remember what you chose to love, what you chose to protect, what you chose to believe in." The electromagnetic pulse devices activated simultaneously across the globe, creating a cascade of interference that shattered the collective intelligence's network like glass. For the first time in weeks, infected groups around the world stopped their coordinated movements and began to act as individuals, confusion and recognition flickering across faces that had been blank with alien purpose. Sarah continued her broadcast, her words serving as an anchor for human consciousness struggling to reassert itself against the cosmic intelligence that had tried to absorb it. "Choose to be human," she said, her voice cutting through the static of a world in transition. "Choose to remember. Choose to resist." The battle for human consciousness raged for hours, with the collective intelligence fighting to reassert control even as Phoenix's counter-signal worked to override the alien programming. Sarah's voice became the focal point of the struggle, her words serving as a beacon that human minds could follow back to individual identity. Slowly, miraculously, the infected began to return to themselves, not as mindless zombies, but as confused, traumatized humans struggling to understand what had happened to them in their world. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, Sarah delivered her final broadcast to a world that was beginning to heal. The collective intelligence had been severed, its communication network shattered, and humanity had chosen to remain human despite the promise of cosmic evolution. The endless night that had consumed America was ending, not with military victory but with the simple, profound choice to remember what it meant to be individuals rather than part of a vast alien whole. "This is Sarah Chin," she said, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and hope, broadcasting from a world that chose to remain human. "The voices in the darkness have spoken, and we have chosen to answer with voices of our own."